we'll start. So good afternoon and welcome to the Yarra Riverkeeper Association's Weeding Toolkit webinar, part 2. I'm Sebastian Pivet and I'm an intern at the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, and today I'll be presenting the weeding webinar, the first expansion. And today, this will continue on from the first weeding toolkit presented from Tom Frawley. And I was given this opportunity to present as I just found it so fascinating from going through this toolkit that weeds are a massive issue in our waterways. So we will look at the management strategies and the classification of some weeds. So before we move on, it is important that I, on behalf of the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, acknowledge that the lands and the waterways of the Yarra catchment and beyond are the unceded territories of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We pay our respects to their ancestors who cared for country since time began, and to all Wurundjeri Woiwurrung community, to all the Kulin Nation, to all traditional owners who continue to speak and care for their country. We acknowledge that the river, now called the Yarra, has been known as a Birrarung by its custodians. So this is a short presentation, being a continuation of the first Weeding Toolkit webinar, which we had introduced our Weeding Toolkit. This presentation will run for about 15 minutes, give or take, and we aim to provide and share the knowledge of weed classification and how weeds are categorized, the different weed control management types and techniques used to manage the many various weed species commonly found along the Yarra, as well as background and how this could be the weed's best friend, and municipal spread and how our actions can sometimes unwillingly lead to the spread of invasive weed species. We'll also have a quick look at the Indigenous practice of cultural burning and a few weed profiles on some of the most common weeds found along the Yarra River. This is a live stream service, so there will be a 5-second delay. So like I mentioned before, the toolkit is an extension and complementary to the first weeding toolkit, with another 2 toolkits yet to be announced in the foreseeable future. So introduction, weeds and why are they a problem? So reductions in biodiversity are a problem throughout the globe, with invasive weeds are seen as a great threat to biodiversity and seen in growing numbers throughout Australia. In the last 25 years, the number of invasive species recorded in Victoria has nearly doubled, in spite of our knowledge and efforts to manage and maintain this threat to our biodiversity. So this toolkit by no means is the be-all and end-all of weeds in Victoria. It is just a stepping stone for increasing our shared knowledge and community engagement with the landscape we as Victorians share with so many unique and special species. So types of weeds found. So in this toolkit, the several weeds that are of primary concern has been categorized into several different classifications. These include environmental weeds, noxious weeds, naturalized plants, and weeds of national significance. So to describe each different type of weed, to be classified as an environmental weed hinges on the capacity for a weed to cause harm to the flora and fauna and surrounding ecosystems that the species has moved into. An important point to note about environmental weeds is that the focus is classifying these plants is on the ecosystem more so than the plant itself. So even both exotic and native species can be classified as environmental weeds if the outcomes are yielding to the ecosystem is considered negative for that ecosystem that they inhabit. In Victoria, there are over 100 different types of noxious weeds, and these can be subcategorized even further to state prohibited weeds, regionally prohibited weeds, regionally controlled weeds, and restricted weeds. Naturalized plants are considered as such once they have established themselves as part of the local plant life in an area outside of their local distribution. Weeds of national significance is of high priority, especially for management tools. So these weeds are picked based on a number of different attributes, including their invasiveness and potential for spread, as well as their environmental, social, and economic impacts. A number of these weeds can be found in this toolkit denoted by this symbol over here. So when you see like the white and blue Australia symbol, that is a weed of national significance. So weed management. So weed management control can be broken down into two components. What type of management strategy is being employed and what techniques are being used to achieve this management goal? Management goals for weeds can fall under four main categories: prevention, eradication, containment, and asset-based protection. So to describe each one briefly, prevention is the management based on denying entry of new weeds into an area. Eradication is management used to permanently remove a species of weed from an area. Containment is the type of management based on reducing or stopping the spread of a weed beyond the area within which it has become established, as well as asset-based protection is a management based on maintaining the value of assets to which weeds pose a threat. This may occur in spaces where value is derived from cultural, environmental, or production assets. So with weed management types, control techniques can also be broadly categorized into four types, as we see in the presentation. These can be described as physical, chemical, cultural, and biological. And to briefly summarize each type of management category, physical control of weeds is the management based on the actual act of removing weeds either physically or mechanically. In a number of projects that will happen next year, we'll be undertaking physical control as the primary way of removing the weeds. And this can be done by removal by hand, burning off, animal grazing, and even mulching. Chemical control, for example, is like the use of herbicide on an environment. However, chemicals are used broadly in some degree in many weeding management plans. However, interventions that cover larger areas of land often are more reliant on chemical application due to their low labour input and their use. But keep in mind, we do not advocate the use of herbicide control by members of the general public, except for professional use like during weed control from some of our future weeding projects. Cultural control is also another one to mention. This is used primarily within human-managed systems such as farms, as well as the management of landscapes and bushland. This method of weed control relies on managing an area in such a way that weed growth is suppressed, rather than relying primarily on the removal or killing off of weeds. Cultural control is increasingly being used in restoration projects as a means of suppressing weeds through the inclusion of target plant species. And to biological control, you might have heard examples of the introduction of the cane toad in Queensland. This is a way, like, for example, an organism can be used to prevent the spread of an invasive weed. So an example could be, like I said, the cane toad, which is used to regulate the cane beetle as observed in Queensland, but that proved disastrous results. But another interesting form of biological control which was proved successful was the introduction of the Castoblastis moth to regulate the prickly pear. So there's a reason why with biological control there's an extensive process to reach approval, because if proved successful, it can be really efficient. But if it's not being administered successfully, it could bring really poor outcomes. And another thing to mention that isn't mentioned on this slide is integrated weed management, which is basically this involves the use of a number of different techniques. This creates a more broadly encompassing action to reduce weeds, and they're spread by complementary practices used in tandem. So hopefully I still have your interest. Gallery of weeds. Now I'd like to ask the audience to help me out with the gallery of weeds section. So I'm going to start off with asking, does anyone know the difference between a weed and... No. Actually, let me repeat that. Does anyone know the difference between a herb and a shrub? Does anyone want to give an answer? So herbs, yeah, I'll just answer it. So herbs are basically green and leafy plants that are used to flavor or season food and used as medicine. Herbs are noticeably smaller. Does anyone know what a shrub is? Amazing, good answers actually, yeah. So herbs are a lot smaller, used for flavoring and food and even used as medicine. And shrubs are woody plants. And shrubs can be removed from the base, and it does grow smaller than a size of a tree. So, all right, thanks for that. Does anyone know the property of what tree weeds are? Well, I won't answer that. The toolkit itself has many great examples of tree, bulb, aquatic, and grass weeds that are of concern along the Yarra River. So definitely have a look at the toolkit. So this is how the toolkit is laid out. As you can see, it is quite user-friendly. The toolkit provides you with photos, a handy description alongside the option for eradication, area of origin, and the optimum times for treatment. The colours represent the 6 indigenous seasons laid over the months of the Gregorian calendar. So quite a useful toolkit. And moving on to causes of concern. So why do weeds spread? So in this toolkit, the primary concern for why weeds spread are the issues of bare ground, municipal spread, and indigenous cultural burning. So bare ground, to basically summarize, is an easy entry point for weeds to grow and spread. So this is because weeds are often the first stage of a soil regenerating itself, as they can help regain soil coverage and soil structure, and so weeds are not bad at all times. However, when trying to contain the spread of a weed, even eradicate certain invasive species, this can leave soil bare, and that can provide opportunity for super adaptable plants to proliferate. So this is a danger because it can create competition for nutrients and water for other native plants otherwise in the area. Municipal spread. So this is a type that can occur because garden waste like clippings are not disposed of properly, or for reasons more or less out of our control. For example, when birds eat in our gardens and they release droppings in other areas. For this reason, it is very important that disposal of gardening waste is managed appropriately, and that when and where possible, local native plants are chosen to populate our gardens instead. Indigenous cultural burning, that's quite an interesting one. So using the use of fire to conduct cultural burning, it's also known as cool burning, as a method of land care holds great significance. So following European settlement of Australia and during this time, land management by Indigenous people has been greatly reduced, and so this practice is not necessarily tied to controlling invasive weed species. It sort of does tie into the previous technique mentioned, which is cultural control, because it does in many ways encourage the growth of beneficial plant species and cultivate a landscape that is highly resilient and functional. So furthermore, acknowledging that the land that we live on was cultivated and managed under Indigenous occupation, it is an important and often overlooked part of the cultural and landscape history of present-day Australia. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone in attendance today. I hope that I've been able to present some interesting points to you and how we as individuals can make a small contribution towards the health of our landscapes and the life that they support. And remember to wear gloves take bags and always pull from the bottom. So returning to the audience, how did everyone fare with using the first toolkit? Now that we have a few minutes of questions, I'll see what we have in the discussion. Feel free to write any questions that you'd like to know that's popped into your mind over the last 15 or so minutes. Amazed to see prickly pear growing in suburban gardens. Who promotes this a weed for the general public? I think I remember growing up as a child, I used to see prickly pear as a thing like people used to have in their gardens. I think it's just for aesthetic, but now that it's been eradicated from biological control, it is an issue. I don't know who's promoted it, but that's a really good question to ask. As I asked before about tree weeds, basically tree weeds are trees that are growing in the wrong place. Is there an app with photos that can be referred to identify weed species? I'm sure there is, but I'm not entirely too sure. I've used Frog ID, but that identifies frog species. But there could be an app to determine tree species. iNaturalist. Thanks, Kristen. Joanne McPhee says, I'm interested to know what council considers a weed, as I consider many medicinal edibles. I harvest many, but I'm concerned about spraying. That's a really good point, actually. No worries. So thanks for all your questions. If we haven't had time to answer any of them, please do send us an email. I'll just type the email here for the reference. And we'll definitely follow up. Our stewardship manager, Tom, will get back to you in an email. And I'd also like to add thanks to everyone who participated in watching this webinar. It's my first time doing this, so exciting things. And hopefully we'll see you again in a month for the launch of our next toolkit, the Wildlife Toolkit. Cool. Thanks, Kristen, for answering that. So is the one on the website the old weed kit? So that first weed kit, weed toolkit actually, that was one that was made originally, but this is like an extension to complement the first one. So they are used in tandem basically. The toolkit most likely will be published on the company website. No worries, thanks for that. Hopefully I wasn't too boring. All right, thanks again, everyone. See you all hopefully next month for the next release of our wildlife toolkit, and have an enjoyable day.